In chapter 9, we start talking about Baroque instrumental music. This is a period in time where instrumental music really starts to become its own full genre of music and have many genres of music within itself. We've been talking a little bit about instrumental music in times before this, but this is the first time when instrumental music really stands alone as its own piece of music. So, in this chapter, we are talking about Baroque solo and chamber music, which is music that involves only one player or a small group of players. And in this particular chapter, um, when we start talking about instrumental music, the first thing we talk about is why instrumental music is on the rise, and that is because of various occurrences in this period of time, such as violin makers. The Stradivari family are working very hard to develop the instrument and the class of the violin. There are many improvements being made to wind and brass instruments as well, and the keyboard instruments like the organ and the harpsichord are becoming much more popular. Now, the few types of keyboard pieces that we will be talking about are the toccata, fantasia, and the prelude. You can read more about these in your book and get a few more details about them, but they were short pieces of music, all pretty improvisatory in nature, that were used to introduce our main piece of music called the fugue. So the fugue is one of the more important pieces of music that we will be talking about in this chapter, and it is based on the polyphonic development of a melody. And polyphonic is a polyphonic texture is one of the more important aspects of this genre of music. The melodies may be played or sung depending on what the instrumentation is for the fugue. Generally speaking, we will be looking at keyboard fugues in particular. And usually these types of pieces involve four voices, four different melodies occurring at the same time. It could be it could be two, it could be three, but generally speaking, there are four voices in a fugue, um, and usually those four voices are described as soprano, alto, tenor, and bass melodies. Now, a fugue generally has the same form at the beginning. Every fugue is written the same way, a form that we will be looking at shortly. And then after the main introduction of all of the melodies, after that first part of the form, the rest of the piece of music goes on as a composer would decide. The first section of the piece that we'll be looking at is called the exposition. Now, an exposition of a fugue begins with the subject or the first melody, the introduction of the melody that you will be hearing for the rest of the piece. All right, like any other piece of art, maybe a book or a movie, an exposition is uh, is the first part of a piece of music where we are introduced to the main themes or the important things that we'll be hearing in the piece of music. So in this musical exposition, we start with the subject or the main melody of the piece. After that first subject is introduced, we will hear another subject, which is called the counter subject. This will be the second introduction of the melody that we heard at the beginning of the piece. Once that melody is played, that second melody, the counter subject, we will hear a third and a fourth. These are other counter subjects that that are played after or after each melody comes before it. Once all of the melodies are introduced, all four of those melodies come to a stopping point and transition into the rest of the piece. This transition is called an episode. So once again, an exposition begins with a subject, the first introduction of the melody, and then the second, third, and fourth melodies come in after that in succession. Those are all called counter subjects. And once all of those subjects are stated, they come to a bit of a stopping point, a bit of a transition that is called an episode. You'll be listening to the Little Fugue in G minor by Johann Sebastian Bach, and you will hear the examples of an exposition that we just discussed. There's actually an assignment to go along with that to help you figure out exactly where all of those melodies come in. So when you listen to that piece of music, listen closely to the polyphonic texture and the introduction of each melody as it is played. Moving on, we will be talking about organ literature. The organ was a very popular instrument in the Baroque period, often called the king of instruments. And two pieces that were often played on the organ include the chorale, also known as a hymn, usually a four-part harmony, homophonic piece of music, as well as the chorale prelude, a work based on a chorale where the player or the composer would improvise um, or develop a melody that is based off of a chorale. Another genre of music that we will be talking about is the suite. And a suite was a multi movement work where each movement was based on a dance, some European dance style that influenced the style of music. This is often a confusing term for students as they tend to think that that means that each of these pieces were used to accompany a dance or back up a dance of some kind. And these pieces were based on dances. However, no one actually would perform a dance with them. Very similar to any other piece of music that you might hear in a concert setting. These pieces were meant to be enjoyed while being seated like an audience, not meant to be danced along to. Each of the movements in a suite were named from various various dances in the from the different countries in Europe. And you can see what the different dances are on this slide. Your second listening example is one of those dances, a bourrée, and you can hear that from Bach's Cello Suite Number 3. So make sure you listen to that particular example. You will hear that it is in AABB form, meaning that you will hear one section of music, and then that section will repeat. Then you'll hear a second section, and then that section will repeat. It is a monophonic texture. The cello performs by itself and is the only line of music to hear. Moving on, we will talk about the genre of music called the sonata. And in this period of time when the sonata was being developed, it had quite a few different definitions to go along with it. Many different pieces of music could be defined as a sonata. It essentially was any multi-movement work that a composer wrote for one or more instruments. So we have a few different definitions of different terms of sonata to go over. First, there was the Sonata da Chiesa, which was a sonata written for church or a religious piece of music. Then there was a Sonata da Camera, a sonata written for the chamber, the home, the palace, a secular piece of music. Later in the Baroque period, there were three types of sonatas that were generally classified. One being the sonata, excuse me, one being the sonata, um, which just meant it was an unaccompanied instrument just by itself. A solo sonata, which featured one instrument and had continuo instruments playing accompaniment, so one bass instrument, as we've talked about before, and one chordal instrument, such as a cello and a harpsichord, for example. And another example was the trio sonata, which was often a string trio, two violins and a cello, along with a keyboard playing continuo, so just a one keyboard playing both the bass parts and the harmonies. One of the major composers that we will be studying besides Bach in this chapter is Elizabeth Claude Jacquet de la Guerre, a prominent female composer who was a child prodigy, knew many different instruments, and composed quite a bit of music, especially in support of King Louis XIV, who helped fund her music education and her compositions. Our third listening example is one of Elizabeth Claude's pieces, which you can hear. It was um, a sonata, a multi movement work for violin and basso continuo. And when you are listening to this piece of music, you will hear the example of a rondo form, which was a form used to introduce a theme of music and bring that theme back, have that theme return throughout the piece of music.